Superman and Lois, Season 3, Episode 6 of Sound Mind. We begin this episode with Clark attending a support group. When other people start talking about preparing for the end of life, Clark gets uncomfortable and decides that the group isn't for him. Lois gets invited to lunch by Pia, who is also receiving treatments, so she can enjoy the meal before her taste buds go from the chemotherapy. Lana has work to do, so Sarah gets stuck with Sophie. Sarah is trying to study, so she says, "Can't Dad watch Sophie?" Of course, it isn't Kyle's day to have the girls, but then Kyle gets stuck with Sarah and Sophie. They're at the fire station where Jonathan is washing one of the fire trucks over and over again. Kyle has put him in a t-shirt that says Rusty on the back and is much too large. It appears to be some sort of hazing ritual, though quite benign, to be honest, relatively speaking. Eventually, Sarah and Sophie and Kyle end up back at Kyle's place. Sarah is trying to study. Jonathan comes over to study with her, and Kyle goes out because he had plans already. Of course, he doesn't say that. He just says, oh, he's got to go out and do something, leaving his girls there. Sophie gets hungry, and Sarah just lets her go out to go get something to eat. And then when Lana shows up an hour later, well, Sophie's still not there. So they all have to go out looking for Sophie. She's eventually found out at the fairgrounds, and she'd been talking about wanting to go to the fair. When is the fair? It was the logical place to find her if you'd been listening to what she had been saying. That's where Jonathan talks to her about feeling like an afterthought, because obviously now that Jordan has powers, Jonathan is feeling pretty left out, understandably so. This leads Kyle to have more respect for Jonathan. In fact, Jonathan earns his own name on the back of his shirt after that. I think Kyle was very grateful for the words that Jonathan was saying to Sophie. So that was good.
Those words that he got on his shirt, it's an upgrade over Rusty, but I believe it said like Little Kent or Lil Kent or something? It said
Lil Kent,
so
yeah.
It was still demeaning, but at least it was a personalized demeaning.
Yeah. Well, that's one of those things that happens when you live in a small town and you're like the third or fourth or fifth generation to live there. You're always defined by your so-and-so's granddaughter or their daughter or son or, whatever. You're always defined through the generations that came before you.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, he didn't actually get his name on the shirt. He just got something that was more personalized for him.
All right, I'll give you that one. The other thing that came out with this is that when Sophie was missing, Lana went looking for Kyle and she found him at the store. And with him at the store was Chrissy. Kyle was trying to explain that he'd already had plans to go out hiking, and Lana's like, well, when have you ever had an interest in hiking? And that's when she saw Chrissy. So Chrissy was right. Kyle should have come clean with Lana from the very beginning and just said, look, I'm seeing someone, it's Chrissy, and just been upfront about it, because something like this wouldn't have come out this way, leaving Chrissy feeling absolutely horrible. So, at the end of the episode, Chrissy is just assuming that Kyle's getting ready to dump her, but it was actually quite the opposite. He wanted to go public with their relationship as boyfriend and girlfriend, and Chrissy is actually quite happy about that. So that's what's going on with those two. Superman gets called to the DOD because Deadline wanted to talk to him and would only talk to Superman. The DOD was skeptical. They didn't believe that, they weren't sure if Deadline was actually sick and dying, but Superman did his X-ray vision thing on him and confirmed that yes, his body is riddled with tumors and he's getting ready to die. Deadline told Superman he wanted to be taken to Mannheim. Superman does. Of course, Mannheim denies having anything to do with Deadline. So then Superman takes Deadline to a hospital where Deadline dies. Considering that Deadline had XK and Superman's blood in him, Lois postulates that what if this isn't about giving these people powers? What if it's about trying to keep them alive? Which was obviously telegraphing something else that would be coming up in this episode concerning Mannheim's motivations. It's when Clark gets home that Jordan walks in wet. Clark is upset to learn that Jordan was out saving people while Clark was away, and Lois tells Clark that she told Jordan to go. she had to make that decision. Clark is upset because he's afraid of Jordan getting injured or killed. You can tell Lois is getting less patient with Clark, and we will get to that later in the synopsis here. Mannheim is getting desperate for the new serum. He appears to be trying to reanimate Bizarro. He sent Lois a bunch of files to try to keep her busy. He has a plan to get Superman off of his back as well. Lois wants to prepare paperwork for an end-of-life plan, but Clark refuses to admit that Lois's death is even a possibility. This is where we start to see Lois getting very frustrated with Clark because he is just completely unhelpful in what she needs right now as support in dealing with her cancer. Jordan is getting better skills and he's actually beating the simulations at the fortress, but Clark is still holding him back. It's because Clark is scared and he's talking about how they still don't know all of Jordan's vulnerabilities. Jordan responds by saying that they also don't know all of his strengths either, and how is he ever supposed to develop anything if he's not allowed to do anything? Clark's holding him back because he's afraid of Jordan getting hurt. Lois goes out and has that lunch with Pia. Pia defends Mannheim and talks about how her husband had a lot of the same denial of reality as Clark. Lois shares with Pia that she thinks the hospital is a cover for something else. Pia, she doesn't want to talk about that, so she just lets that go and just says, you know what? You're Lois Lane, who am I to argue with your gut instinct? Lois confronts Clark about what is going on with him, and she explains to Clark that his pretending that every human on Earth couldn't just drop dead at any second isn't helping her, and that cancer is Lois's villain. He keeps pretending that it doesn't exist. Lois tells Clark she's going for a ride and she doesn't want him to follow her. While Lois is gone, Clark goes and apologizes to Jordan. Jordan points out to his father that he had to figure out everything for himself, but Jordan has Superman to guide him. Clark has been trying to keep Jordan wrapped in bubble wrap because he's scared of losing the people he loves, which makes sense given how many people Clark has already lost. At this point, Clark is making bad decisions because of his fear, which almost always leads to people making bad decisions, which happens because when Clark and Jordan are sitting there talking, they hear Lois yelling for Superman to help, and Clark just gets up and goes to the voice. And of course, he didn't think this through because of his fear. Of course, it's Earface and 3 goons with kryptonite weapons. And when Lois gets home, Jordan tells her what happened. Obviously, Lois knows it was a trap, so she has Jordan listen for Clark and to tell her what he hears. It's obvious that Clark's in trouble, but there's no time to call the DOD, so Lois tells Jordan to prove Clark wrong and prove that he is ready to start saving people and that he needs to go save his father. So Jordan goes. We finally get to see what he looks like in his new superhero outfit, which was kind of dorky, but it really works on that kid. So he disrupts the attack. He gets hit by one of the kryptonite weapons. So, this is Clark's worst fear coming true. Clark appears to go a little bit nuts, and he takes out the last goon, and he defeats Earface. Jordan is just laying there unconscious on the ground. Jordan finally takes a breath and comes to, and that's when we see that Earface has gotten away. At this point, Lois is waiting at home, and Jonathan arrives. He's telling Lois how he's no longer wearing the rusty shirt down at the firehouse, and that he has a shirt with his own name on it, and that's when Jordan and Clark walk in and overshadow him, that they were out defeating the bad guys, and Jordan was saving Clark's life. Jordan saw the shirt that Jonathan was holding and asks him, Lil Kent, what are you, the worst rapper in Kansas? This clearly hurt Jonathan's feelings. He just retorts that Sarah thought it was cool and walks out of the room. And of course, at the mention of Sarah, Jordan follows him. Clark tells Lois that she was right. Jordan's human side saved him and might even make him stronger than Clark. And he admits that Jordan getting shot was the worst moment of his life. For the first time, he can't keep Lois safe. He feels powerless, but he promises to be better at being there for her. Lana and Sarah apologize to Sophie about her feeling left out. They're going to play video games together. Lana mentions burger time. That seemed to parallel the previous season when Clark was trying to teach Jordan to fly, and he mentioned the Kessel Run. This moment between parent and child where the parent references something from their own childhood and the kid is like, what are you talking about? So it was a cute little moment. Sophie asks if Dad can join them to play video games. Lana tells her, maybe some other time. And Clark goes back to the support group. I think that's going to be good for him because it shows that he's finally accepting the situation. I think he's finally going to be able to start actually being there for Lois in a way that she needs him to be. And then we see Mannheim and Earface, and Earface tells Mannheim that Superman is still alive. We find out that Earface is actually Pia, who is getting the cancer treatments with Lois. She is getting sicker, and it looks like she's probably getting ready to die herself. And Mannheim tells her not to worry because Dr. Hook is getting close and that he's going to save her, which really makes it seem like Mannheim is probably the husband who was just refusing to accept that death is a possibility for her. And that's pretty much how this episode ended. The revelation of who Pia is, Mannheim's motivation, and Clark going back to the support group to try to be a more supportive husband and father. For the most part, I thought this was a pretty good episode. I had a few issues with it. One of them being that I wish they would address how they're paying for these cancer treatments. I mean, maybe I missed it. Maybe this is all 100% charity. If they're going to try to present what it's like to have cancer and to go through cancer treatments like this, I wish they would present the reality of what it's like to have to deal with the American healthcare system and how that bankrupts so many people and all the GoFundMes and the fundraisers and just how much more stressful that makes being sick. I wish they would address that, but who knows, maybe that'll come in a future episode.
I guess the assumption we're supposed to make is that Lois had some sort of health insurance through that Smallville newspaper, but what sort of insurance did they have? I mean, come on, a small business like that, she's going to be paying a lot out of pocket for that.
Well, she's probably got a plan purchased through the marketplace. If indeed Kansas has one, an exchange, I don't even know. So yeah, they probably don't have very good health insurance. Let's be honest. Because even people with Cadillac insurance in this country, oftentimes there's going to be a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. And unless you're rich, you're not going to be able to afford this. You're just not.
I actually enjoyed quite a bit of this episode. I thought there was a lot of scenes that came together later. And there were callbacks, like you mentioned, with the Burger Time line. But there was another callback, I thought, where Lois and Pia, who were at that restaurant, and there was a bit of a debate going on. It was similar to the debate that Kyle was having in the very first episode of the series about whether this hospital, even if it was doing nefarious things, if it ends up healing people, do the ends justify the means? That's similar to the debate that Lois and Kyle were having in the first episode of the series when Morgan Edge was going to come into Smallville and revitalize the mine and put people back to work. And Lois was asking, well, what if this guy has a history of doing bad things? And Kyle was responding back with, yeah, but it's putting people to work here, people who need jobs, who are supporting families. So I thought that conversation was similar to that conversation where it's like, even if Mannheim is doing bad things, and I'm not saying he is, but if he was, is that really so wrong if it's helping people? And there was no answer to that question. It was a very open-ended question. The viewer was left to ponder that coming out of that lunch that they had. And I also thought in that same lunch, when Lois was talking to Pia about how Clark was having trouble accepting Lois's situation, and she mentioned about Clark is the most optimistic person she ever knew. And I think that's where the problem with Clark kicking in here, this goes to when he was talking about Jordan, how Jordan would actually be stronger, not physically, but because he had a human piece to him that might actually make him a better rounded person than Clark, who's strictly Kryptonian. We all know that Clark, Superman, mythos-wise, has this Messiah-type complex. He's always trying to save everybody whenever he can. And in, I think it was the first episode of this season, maybe the second, Clark was having those reoccurring dreams of Lois being in some sort of earthquake or the building was getting ready to collapse on her, and he was trying to fly there very quickly to save her, and he would wake up in a cold sweat because he couldn't do it. And I think that's where Clark is struggling, is he's so used to saving everybody. If he just tries hard enough, he can do that. But with Lois and fighting something like a disease, like a cancer, his Kryptonian abilities are completely useless. And he mentioned in that, when he returned back to the group therapy session, he said something like, I need to make sure that I'm available for whoever in my family needs me in whatever role. And I think that was a way for Clark to admit that he's got to obtain more skills than just being Superman and, he can punch through a brick wall and fix anything. Which, again, that also was working interestingly when he was working with his son, Jordan, on his training, and he was talking to his son about tactics. And just because you think you've got the situation covered doesn't mean you really do. Well, it turns out that Clark himself wasn't realizing that he didn't have the right strategy for dealing with Lois's problems. Denial wasn't going to do it. And Lois, I thought, had a very interesting set of lines to him. When she was confronting him, she said, bullets literally bounce off of you. So, we're not sure anything can kill you, but us humans, we're mortal and we have diseases that could take us out. And they didn't go down this path yet, but at some point, because even though Superman ages, I think he ages much slower than humans, we're going to have a Highlander situation here where he's going to outlive his wife and one of his sons. And one day that's going to be a very, very, very difficult thing for him to deal with. So the fact that he's like with this cancer saying, no, you're going to beat it, you're going to beat it. Yeah, let's say she does beat it. You're going to outlive Lois. You're going to outlive one of your sons who doesn't have any extra ability to slow down his aging. You're going to have to deal with death sooner or later. And to me, that kind of reminded me of, to kind of pull in a Star Trek reference here, in Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, when Kirk was trying to avoid dealing at the end of the movie with Spock's death, and he always patted himself on the back because he was able to somehow trick his way out of death all the time, and he finally had to deal with it. This was kind of, to me, a similar moment. They didn't quite explore it as heavily, but that conversation Lois had with Clark about that, about her being mortal, and Superman basically probably is going to outlive all of them. So he'll probably even outlive Jordan, because Jordan's only partially Kryptonian. That could be interesting if they pursue that philosophy a little bit more, because I always thought that was an interesting philosophy. If you were basically an immortal being, you were going to outlive anybody you got close to. Clark has formed this family and bonds with these people on Earth, but one day he's going to outlive all of them, and he's going to have to bury all of them, just like he did his parents. And that's going to be tough on him. I thought there was a lot of good stuff in here. I thought finally mentioning that Jonathan was feeling that he was being forgotten. I thought for 2 seasons that was something they should have brought up, because Jordan was getting all this attention. And I'm not saying Jordan shouldn't have gotten attention, but Jonathan was just kind of left on his own. And so when he shared with the younger sister about how he feels the same way of being forgotten, that was a good moment. If anybody was watching all, I guess now 3 seasons of the show, that was a payoff there for something that was set up as soon as we found out that Jordan had the abilities. The only part I didn't like about this episode, and I shouldn't say I didn't like, it's just, to me, it wasn't, quality material that I was getting into, was that whole Kyle dating Chrissy stuff. That just, to me, was very daytime soap opera type stuff. But the other stuff was dealing with lots of philosophical issues of mortality and do the ends justify the means. If you're somebody who can lift buildings and do all these super things, how do you deal with something that you can't fix by just punching it? I just thought there was a lot here that I thought worked for me. I thought this was a good episode, even though it didn't have necessarily a lot of action scenes going on. There was a lot of interesting dialogue in this episode for me.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of character growth.
This episode felt to me like it could have fit into the first season. And that's a good thing because I enjoyed the first season on and off, but most of the first season I enjoyed. This felt like a first season episode to me. Personally, this might be my favorite of the season so far. So we'll see where this goes.
I would agree. Definitely my favorite of this season so far. As I said, my only complaint was who's paying for these cancer treatments. I mean, as I said, I assume Mannheim's hospital is a charity, but at the same time, I wish they would at least talk about how cancer treatment tends to bankrupt people and cost them their houses and things like that. But otherwise, yes, the character development that we saw in this episode was really good. And as you said, it would have fit in with season 1. So maybe things are starting to get back on track with this season. We're almost halfway through.
We've mentioned before how this season has been up and down with visual effects. When Jordan and Clark were inside his fortress training with these holograms, that was well done. I thought it was really well done as far as the effects themselves. But this season off and on has had iffy and then good effects, so it's hard to know what you're going to get. But what little visual effects they did have in this episode, I thought were well done.
The season has been weird as far as what the quality is going to be like episode to episode, but this was definitely one of the good ones. So, anybody else watch this episode of Superman and Lois? If you did, let us know in the comments what you thought. Do you agree or disagree with what we saw? Was there anything that we missed that you want to talk about?
Take care.